The section where I'm actually overlaying some of the polymer clays. It's a way that mixed media can work really well when you mix the similar media, like this is of the same polymer clay, the blue and the brown. It goes back to a certain sort of primitivism, I think, the earthy colours. If you consider, for example, early 20th century Cubism and Art Deco were often incorporating repetitive patterns that was reminiscent of African sculpture. The Art Deco movement was, in a sense, incorporating African primal culture, religions with a lot of the work, the close-up views here, are in relation to sort of fine details like the sort of underlying structure of the whole piece, and then how that interacts with the kind of recent additions and the additions prior to that, like the clear casting resin here, maybe a year after the fiberglass shape of the Hebel block and how I carved it out. So in some sense it's a mould. So in a sense what I'm doing is just going into the finer details of the polymer clay and experimenting with how it sits on top of this older structure here. And on top of that you have the clear casting resin, which is a recent addition. Through an interaction, through causation, they started to crack apart and sort of creating all these fissures and cracks here with this cracked earth theme at the moment. And that's part of what we're looking at in Australia, for example, the deserts. So it has definitely a cultural aspect. So in some sense what I am doing is very prototypical, and yet on the other hand, because I'm looking at it from a syncretic religious point of view as well, it's not necessarily prototypical. And that makes it all the more interesting, really. Dried clay. Applied the clay, it's dried. So what I observed was the cracks starting to appear along the sides. They also appeared on the underneath part here. It lifts off from the fiberglass. That was the intention. So part of the intention of creating the artwork was to allow it to interact with the environment. And then I proceeded to put the air-dried clay along the edge here, and that's being reinforced with this steel rod. However, once it dries up, what occurs is a lift-off, and that's allowed me then to work another medium. So that's the mixed media part, and that's this putty here. So this is a putty that I've used to subsequently work in underneath. So my focus here is on the edge, and it's in relation to just giving it a little bit more contrast, and so just wanting to sort of bring that back a bit. And I'm using this polymer clay, cut into it and give it some sort of roughness and a sense of the environment. And that's the sort of process that creating a contrasting set of features to emulate in a way the complexity of a particular place, the environment being a holistic. And it brings up the question, like, could, for example, technology develop an AGI that has got superpowers? Could it emulate the quirkiness of it? For example, I get a scan, and then one part of me divides and lives in another part of the world. And so would those two parts create something similar? You'd think, well, they're just me. Would I create this? One theory says, yes, I would, because it's the same, it's me. So I'm going to sort of do this. I will come up with something like this. And the other theory says, well, it's to do with the context. So, for example, if you're living in India, you were to give them all the similar tools and features, it wouldn't be this, it would be something else. Maybe I wouldn't even do it. So I've got sort of free agency as far as, or determined by my predispositions. The question is, would I actually even take up? What is an authentic artist? As a continuum with vague boundary. And that's often the problem that people have, is they feel alienated from the means of production because they think, well, I'm not a genuine person doing this. None of it is really authentic because it's to do with human determinism. My biological dexterity is an autonoma in a sense, even though I've got qualia, or the sense through conscious experience. The notion of the freedom that we have is probably constrained to a kind of class of freedom within the means of production that then is linked to having a monetary value within a capitalist system that determines value through the nation state. Primordial expressionism. So, like the notion of this clay is constructed within the modern infrastructure based on knowledge of chemistry. These basic foundational structures within modernity, as technology advances and new materials are formed, like, for example, this clay, is definitely a synthesized version of a more primordial clay, while these are very much smaller blocks. So my experimentation here is to place it within not the oven but outside in the sun. And actually I have done this with previous bits, and after many days in the hot sun, then what I would do is place a bit of this resin on top. How they interact is a syncretic merging of these two primordial. Process being the expression emerging from the environment, how that expresses through, for example, the lifting of the resin to go through a transhumanist sense. So these are then transhumanist pieces of primordial expressions rather than modern ornamentation. Whereas if I were to use this clay to create little figurines of whatever quirky nature I'd like, and then, try to preserve them in some way, that's then part of this mass sort of consumption cycle that everyone in modernity is within. So this humanistic process within modernization, or the discontents of modernization, it would be really a way to find a way to express synthetic elementalism. And that would be finding an element that is synthesized of different parts of the modern sort of condition in a way that you become an expression of that, and that would be then an expression of the artistic transhumanist process. The ancient classical Greeks saw the world in that very humanistic structure like a flat earth. So there was a sort of sense that it was surrounded by this blue stuff. You had then terra terris, or the deep earth, and then you had the blue sky, which was like the capsule that encapsulated the entire structure. So, this is looking at these primordial myths of how humans got to sort of understand environment they were within. This is a proto-scientific worldview, especially when you look at the pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales, who then theorized that it was all water. So that whole notion that this is a watery structure, that even the solid earth was made of water. A way we can express, and this is just on a very sort of simple way, is just to feel that whoever we are a kind of entity, a whole entity within an environment at a particular point in time. And so if that's the case, then there's going to be just enough meaning for the individual to continue the process. And that's a subjective sense of who you are within an environment, who has a sense of their qualitative perception of the world. So the body moving in the world is then a response to the world. And over time, it can create artifacts, which would be like this, that refer to then a name ostensibly relating to a particular locale. Having that localism is then also part of the kind of process, that this is not just referring to a particular embodied being, but the embodiment means a perception of space around it. So we can think of the self as then having a kind of field that emanates, is a virtual, three-dimensional, a fundamental reality. But our senses can produce some of these sort of things as just relics.